Our next presenter now is Amy Murdoch, and Amy is going to be talking to us concerning issues of taxation. Amy is a senior manager based in the Fredericton office of Grant Thornton. She has 12 years of experience in public practice, 9 of which have been spent in tax. Amy is responsible for providing a wide range of tax services, including tax compliance and tax planning services to personal and corporate clients, as well as to not-for-profit and charitable organizations. Amy is on the board of directors of the Fredericton Community Foundation and is actively involved in her church and her daughter's school. So Amy, welcome.
Hello. So Irene asked me to come speak about what some of the tax effects could be of alternative use of some of the church buildings. So just kind of starting at the top, the Income Tax Act provides that registered charities are exempt from income tax on all of their activities. So the good news is that whatever you do with the buildings, it shouldn't be subject to tax. The bad news is that if you do things that are unacceptable activities, it's much worse than the activity being subject to tax. It's the potential revocation of charitable status. So that's a bad news story. If your charity status gets revoked, you have to dissolve and distribute all of your property to another organization. So that's really a very last resort. You have to have done something really bad for the Canada Revenue Agency to come along and say, we're going to revoke your status. Most cases, they're going to say, we're going to give you a warning, and if you've been doing something you shouldn't be, we're going to say, stop doing it, and kind of clean up your act and get back to your purpose. So both the Income Tax Act and charity law say a registered charity is supposed to conduct all of its activities for charitable purposes. So if you start to go too far astray so that your charitable purpose is no longer the predominant activity, they'll come along and say, stop that, refocus on what you're supposed to be doing in the first place. So as I said, it has to be something really bad. So if it's just that you've been doing a business activity that perhaps you shouldn't have been, that will usually result in the warning that says, get back on track. The really bad things that can result in revocation are typically not filing your charity return with Canada Revenue. They really don't like that because they like to know what you're doing. And so if you don't file that return on a timely basis, they'll come along and say, well, if you can't follow the rules, then we're going to say you can't be a charity anymore. The other ones that will get you in trouble are fraud. They really don't like that. And things like getting involved in tax shelters and tax schemes. You may have heard information in the news about like buy low, donate high, and some of those activities will get you in trouble. So there's 3 types of charities. There's charitable organizations, there's private foundations, and there's public foundations. And the reason I bring that up is that the churches, parishes, the dioceses are charitable organizations, and some of what I'm going to say doesn't apply to private foundations. There's some things that charitable organizations can do that private foundations aren't allowed to do. So just in case anyone is also a part of a board for a private foundation, some of what we're going to talk about today you can't do if you're part of a private foundation. So church buildings, you've acquired them for use in your mission. And as long as they're being used as part of your core activities, there's no problem. So what happens if you start to use them for something else? Well, the Income Tax Act says that a charitable organization can conduct a related business, and things will still be okay. So, what is a related business? What's an acceptable activity versus an unacceptable activity? And that kind of goes back to, what is a business to begin with? And a business is a commercial activity. So it's something that you're doing to earn a profit. If you're conducting an activity and there's no reasonable expectation of profit, then it's not a business, and that's fine. So if you're doing something with the idea to generate a profit, and even if you're going to use that profit in church activities, the use of the profit, that's not enough of a connection to say that it's a related business to the charity's main goals. It's really, what is the activity? And so there's examples of what's okay. What I'll start with is, if you've got your church properties and you're going to rent them out, in general, that would be considered an investment activity. That's using the charity's assets to the best, to their income earning potential. So at charity law says that the directors of the organization are responsible to use the assets of the organization so as to obtain the best return within the bounds of prudent investment principles. So as directors, as people responsible for the organization's assets, our responsibility is to make sure that they're used appropriately. And letting something sit vacant, dormant, is not necessarily the best use of that asset. So if they're rented out, that's typically viewed as investment income, and that's an acceptable use. What turns something from being an investment asset into a business asset is really about how much time it takes to manage that asset. So if you have a church rectory and you rent it out to a family because the parish doesn't need it for its own purposes anymore, and the activity is to collect monthly rent and to make sure that the property doesn't fall into disrepair, so just regular overall maintenance of the building, that's perfectly acceptable. If you start turning it into more of a hoteling kind of business where you're doing housekeeping and providing meals and that type of thing, or you have so many rental properties that you're now conducting a rental business, then you could be falling into unacceptable activities. So some of the So a related business, there's two types of related business for a charitable organization. One of them is a business that's run substantially all by volunteers. So if you've got something going on that you've got 90% or more of the activities being conducted by volunteers, whatever that is, it doesn't matter whether it's related to the charity's main goals, it's okay. The other type of business that's okay is one that is linked to the charity's purpose, but that's subordinate to the purpose. So subordinate means that the charity's main goal is always the most important thing. It's what dominates decision making. It's what dominates what activities you're involved in. You're not going to go off and do something that's completely contradictory to the charity's primary purpose. So it's important that always like the tenets that Randall has talked about, those are your main focus. That's what you're making sure everything you do falls within those goals. So businesses that are linked to the charity's purpose and that are subordinate to its purpose generally fall into 4 categories, four forms of connection. The first being a usual and necessary concomitant of charitable programs. So these are activities that supplement the charity's programs. They're necessary for the effective operation of the charity. So examples would be if you've got a hospital and you've got a parking lot, the fees to park in the parking lot are associated with the church's principal business. Another is an offshoot of a charitable program. So that's something that within the ordinary conduct of the charity's operations, there's a good or a service that comes out of that the entity can sell. But it's not a principal focus. So something like King's Landing, they have farming, and so there's vegetables that they grow in part of their operations to show you what it looked like to live hundreds of years ago. And if they sell those, that's fine, because the reason that they were brought into place in the first place is because of their educational programs. Or if a church has a really great choir and they make recordings of it and they sell the recordings for however much they can get market value, the sale of those, that's fine, because the original purpose, the reason that they came into place, is in the delivery of the religious services. So that's also an acceptable related business. This one is one that is most related to your church buildings. And it's a use of excess capacity. So if you've got assets that are necessary to conduct your charitable programs, so you've got your buildings, you've got your parking lots, those types of things that you need in order to deliver your church services. You had your rectories that housed your church officials, your priests, pastors, and that's why the charity has them in the first place, but now we've got some excess capacity, so they're not in use all of the time. And we're going to earn some money from using them during the downtime. That is a use of excess capacity, and that is acceptable. So an example would be if the church has a parking lot that's big enough to accommodate all of the congregants on Sunday morning, and during the work week it sits empty and you're in a prime location downtown and you want to rent out the parking spaces, then that's using the church asset during a downtime and using the excess capacity to get a return, and that's perfectly acceptable. So one of the things to be cautious of is to think about, is it during excess capacity, or is it something that used to be used by the church that is no longer required and will no longer, and is not expected to be used by the church again in the future? So if you've got a rectory that's sitting empty and because currently the priest and his family or her family don't use it, but you expect that it will be necessary again sometime down the road and the church is going to maintain it, then that's okay. That's the use of excess capacity. If you've got buildings that you're not using anymore and you don't expect to ever use in the delivery of your program again, then that's not necessarily the use of excess capacity. It's either becoming an investment asset or an unacceptable use of property. With those buildings, it may be that you think you're going to sell it down the road, but you're going to hold on to it now because the real estate market is not great, and you wouldn't necessarily get the best return if you were to sell it now. So that's something that's okay to take into account. Or it's not something that can be readily disposed of. So for real estate, those are kind of tied together. You might not be able to dispose of it because it's not necessarily a great market. So if you can rent it out instead, that's great. That's kind of falling within charity law that says you're supposed to use the assets to create a good return. The last activity is the sale of items that promote the charity or its objects. So you can also have a business that is promoting the charity's core activities. So it just might be promotional materials that you can sell that have a logo on them or that promote the mission. So if you're looking at something to see if you're doing enough of it for it to be a business, some of the criteria that you look at is how much of the organization's time does it take to manage that activity? And are you getting to the point that that's taking more of your time than what the core objectives should be? So if you've got parish council meetings and you're spending them all talking about what do we do with these properties and should we be renting them out and there's these problems, you could be straying into the side that you're starting to conduct a business activity that's an unacceptable activity. As long as it's something that doesn't require a lot of time, it's more of an investment asset and it's okay. If you've got commercial activities that are requiring you to apply a lot of resources to them, so a lot of funds, you're looking at bottom line as opposed to the core objectives of the organizations. Again, you might be getting into some unacceptable activities. So as I kind of started at the beginning, as long as you're focusing on your mission and the use of the buildings is just to make sure you're getting the best kind of bang for your buck, you're getting a return, you should be fine. There shouldn't be any adverse tax implications to any of that. And kind of the message is that unless you're doing something that's really, really off, really disconnected to the rest of the organization's objectives, then you should be okay. And even if it strayed a little bit too far, you'd get a warning from Canada Revenue Agency. Pardon? Does anyone have any questions? Anything related to what I've talked about or any other tax-related questions? Yes?
This has to do not with the federal government, but with the provincial government, because there are taxes and what organization can be tax-free in terms of properties. And one of the issues I've been asking sometimes is, what about the church who rents out its hall to someone else to use? Does that hall then become taxable or not?
From like a property tax perspective?
Tax point of view.
I am not sure of that, but if you, I have business cards with me. If you send me that question, I can find out. That would be something that the lawyers would probably be a little bit more familiar with.
Thank you.
Yes.
You were saying if we're looking at something that is that costs a lot of money, where the consideration of the bottom line is a big deal, does that mean if you're looking at taking out a huge loan, that could be considered as unacceptable activity?
If you're taking out a huge loan to finance business activity,
Only for business.
only for business activity. If you're taking out a loan to finance the charity's regular operations, that's okay. But if you're borrowing in order to finance the business activity, that can be an indication that it's no longer a subordinate activity to the charity's overall purpose.
So mortgages wouldn't be a problem?
Mortgages wouldn't be a problem as long as they're being used in the church's core activities.
For building improvements?
That's right. Yeah. But if you were borrowing to buy a new building to rent out, that can be an indication of a problem. If you're borrowing against an existing building, whether it's being used for, say, rentals, or it's being used for, it's the church's building, as long as the funds are it's the use of the funds, as long as they're being reinvested in the church's core activities, that should be fine. Yes?
Amy, I'm just wondering, I recently found out that in Germany, part of the general taxation that takes place there goes to pay for the maintenance of some of the lovely old churches in the German society. Do you think that we're close to that in Canada?
No, I don't see that happening.
Thank you for your answer.
Yes.
Just not sure if it's your department or not, but for this area, but you mentioned a rental of church properties and so on. Now, my understanding, deficient as it may be, is that it's already to receive a donation for the use of a parish room or a building, whatever the case may be, for a particular function. But if we're going to charge rent to other user groups, outside user groups, then we really need to charge rent to the inside user groups. Otherwise, the participants in those user groups are receiving a benefit from membership, which interferes with the income tax they receive at the end of the year for their charitable giving.
Yes. So I guess, yes, if you're allowing the group, well, I guess part of it could be it depends on what the internal groups are using it for. So if someone is from internal but they're using it for an outside function that has nothing to do with the church activities, then yes, you could be running into an issue about what you can issue as far as a charitable donation receipt. If they're using the facilities for church-related activities or programs, then I don't think you run into the same issue, but I guess you're probably not charging them anything in that case.
Yeah. So they should be charged. My understanding is some churches try to get around that by having a fee for a rental, but forgiving it for user groups. But to me, that's kind of shady.
Yeah.
You know.
I think that's a good point, because then, yes, you could be running into trouble as far as your charitable donation receipts and what you're allowed to issue on those. Any other questions?